So right now I'm sitting in front of a painting by Rob Shillady. It's the last painting in a narrative trilogy that took him 8 years to complete. This one is titled Triumph of Irrational Dogma, which is the subject of tonight's talk. Rob will talk about his trilogy, and I think you're going to find it very interesting. So I'll just give you a brief background about Rob. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1947, grew up on the Cape. He studied silkscreen at the Decorah Museum School, and he holds a BFA from Boston University School of Fine Arts. Rob's work has been selected by the Portland Museum of Art Biennial 3 times in 2005, 2007, and 2011. He's exhibited widely since 1974, and his work has appeared in numerous reviews and publications, including Paintings of Maine, a New Collection, which is a book by Carl Little. Shillady lives with his wife, the author Ellen Borman, in Brooklyn, Maine. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Rob.
Thank you, Karen. I want to thank you and Mike first for supporting me for the last 15 years since you began. I've been with you, and I know I'm not the kind of artist that makes you much money, but thank you for showing my work.
We love you anyway, Rob.
Yeah. And I want to thank Sarah especially because she worked hard to get the slideshow, or whatever you call these things nowadays, up, and she's great to work with. So do you want me just to start?
Yeah, I'd start right at, right with what.
Okay.
How you got started as an artist.
No, well, wait, I want to read the Susan Sontag thing, okay?
Oh, okay.
Okay. This is Susan Sontag, who was an art critic in 1971 and wrote a book. I think it was called Interpretation. But I think this was from an article that ended up being in the book. It's, quote, "Real art has the capacity to make us nervous. Interpretation makes art manageable and conformable," unquote. And I would add comfortable. Tonight, I do not mind identifying what this is trying to tell you is I don't mind identifying images, but I don't really want to interpret them to you because my interpretation of the images isn't even necessarily what the artists who painted them or photographed them or whatever meant by them. It's what they've become in my mind. Okay, I decided to be an artist when I was 14 years old. I have 2 styles, a narrative style and a landscape style. The narrative style, I sort of think it's sort of like writing a novel, whereas the landscape is more like writing essays or nature writing, something of that nature. As time has gone on, as I've done this over the years, the 2 have sort of melded together. The landscapes get more narrative and the narratives get more landscape. Narrative, I'm going to tell you now who my influences were. And in narrative, Max Beckman would be my most important influence. And Peter Bruegel, the elder, would also be, and pretty much all the Northern European Renaissance painters. And later, when I grew up, Red Grooms and Neil Jenny, I would call my narrative influences. Landscape, which I really have always done just for myself. I like to go out in the woods and stand there, and as most of you know, I go backpacking and canoeing and all sorts of other things outside, and I like being outside with my easel. And even though I may work outside on a painting for a couple of weeks, I end up spending another couple of months inside, if not even longer, in my studio working on it too. So it loses all the fresh airness of it, but it becomes my world. My influences when I was young was Thomas Cole, who was sort of the father of the Hudson River School. And what's interesting about him to me is that he does include narrative in his landscapes. Durand is another Hudson River painter who has some narrative in his paintings. And then there's Frederick Church, who just makes glorious, huge paintings of landscape. And then later, when I grew up again, it was Neil Welliver. So, and I think I didn't really discover him until maybe 1978 or something. So, next slide, Karen. Okay, this is an early Max Beckmann. I remember going when I was, I don't know how old I was in high school. I went to Connecticut over Christmas and New Year's vacation and stayed at a friend's house who was next to a train line that went into New York. We took a trip into New York and went to MoMA, where his retrospective was going on. And he had died 10 years earlier. And I fell in love with him because of his narrative and because, well, I liked his colors. This picture here is a very early one and isn't as colorful, but the guy in the middle there with the mask on is, I believe, a self-portrait of Max Beckmann. He was a German expressionist. His colors in later paintings, Departure is one of them, which is owned by the MoMA and is probably known by everybody. Interesting about him is his triptychs, and that's what I care about. And doing a triptych essentially allows you to divide things into seasons, times, happenings, and it makes the composition overall 3 times more complicated. Next. Okay, this is Red Grooms. Red Grooms, in 1971, I was just out of art school. I was working as a picture framer on Cape Cod, and I went up to Boston to stay on the weekend over at a friend's house. And we were walking down Mass Ave in Cambridge, and we came to this little storefront, and there was this redheaded guy outside it, sort of trying to lure people in. And we went in, and interesting enough, it was called Target Discount Store. And I guess this is where Target stores started, because it was. So I think Red Groom should have gotten some sort of commission or something from Target stores, if that's the case. Anyway, I went in, my friend and I, Michael and I, went in the store, and he sort of was by himself, and he guided us around, and there was all this stuff, everything you would find in the 5 and 10 cent store, made out of paper mache and wood and cardboard and painted. It was a great thing. It was fun. And I didn't know who he was at this point. And so I left. And then around 2 months later, I was looking through an art news, and there was Mr. and Mrs. Rembrandt, a big, huge 3-dimensional picture of Mr. and Mrs. Rembrandt. And I saw that it was Red Grooms, and I finally put it together. This here is a very early piece while he was still sort of, he had gone, I think he taught at Skowhegan at some point. He may have gone there as well. This is Slab City Rendezvous. I can identify the people here. The guy on the roof is a guy named Rudy Burkhart. He is really a photographer, although back in this day he was doing some painting. The guy at the door on the right with the red hair is Red Grooms, and he has a little bucket of what we assume is blueberries. The woman in front of her with the fisherman's hat is Ada Katz. And the guy on the far left is Alex Katz. The woman with the cat in her lap in the middle, to the left, is Yvonne Jacquet. I don't know how many people know her, but she does aerial views generally, or at least she used to, of all around like Thomaston and Belfast and things like that. The woman in the right reading the book is Mimi Gross, who's Red Groom's wife, and the guy in front is named Edwin Demby. He's a poet. Whether he's still alive or not, and I think Rudy Burkhart's dead. I don't know, but that painting's at the Farnsworth. Okay. This is my studio, or a corner of my studio. On the lower right-hand corner is the painting I'm working on now, except that's a sketch of the painting. You can barely see it. It's on an easel. And why we put this up is because on the left, those three paintings there, why don't you go to that so they don't have to stare at the next slide, so they don't have to stare at this, Karen.
At the mess, I think it's pretty interesting.
I know.
So the top painting in those three is the next slide.
Okay. As I said, Paul Cézanne, and this is the period I like about Paul Cézanne. I like the colors that he's using, but I also like the fact that he uses hard edge. Everything's sort of hard edge for the most part. I'm not that thrilled about when he starts playing around with Cubism, but at this period, I really sort of liked his work. And actually, I like the way it's more impressionistic, I guess.
Just so nobody thinks you own the original, Rob, these are three prints, correct?
Right. These are just, no, I don't own the original. These are three prints I framed in 1971. Go to the next, Karen. Okay, these are Bruegel's. Obviously, the one on the right, the wedding dance, you can see those colors in my paintings. Bruegel and I both like the same bright reds and bright colors. The one on the left is more of a landscape in a way, with a lot of narrative going on in it. And so I've always loved Bruegel. In fact, there's a couple, I think there's one, I don't know which one, at the Boston Museum, which I would have seen all the time. Next. Okay, this is the End of Dada. This is the first of what I call my three history paintings. What I mean by history paintings is that I use historical or contemporary artists to make my point. Notice there's a question mark after Dada, the end of Dada. It's because Dada just keeps getting carried on and carried on and carried on. And so back in 2004, there was a poll done by some university or foundation that asked curators and critics and artists, 500 of them, what was the most important piece of the 20th century? And 64% came up with The Fountain by Marcel Duchamp, who's on the left there, and the fountain's the urinal sitting on the ground in back there in the middle. I'll just sort of run through quickly There's a Jasper Johns Valentine can down in the front right. Man Ray is the woman with Man Ray is the photographer who did the woman with the clefts in her back. Hugo Ball is the guy with the red on the left. In back behind Duchamp is one of the first Dadas. Then right to the right of him is a Robert Rauschenberg. I forget the title of it. And then finally, and behind him is Edward Keinholz, who's a pop artist. Robert Rauschenberg, they call a neo-Dadaist. I've never heard that till I looked it up. Okay, this is a little detail from it. I'm just going to go through the 3 artists, or actually 4 artists in this. Joseph Beuys is the father in Germany, father of the Fluxus movement in Germany. He's on his way to chop the rope, and that anvil will fall down on and destroy the fountain by Armut or Duchamp that's down below it. And I don't know, maybe the Fluxus movement would have never happened if he had done that. Anyway, Fluxus movement, what he did was revive happenings. Happenings and performance art started, as far as I can tell, with the Café Voltaire in Zurich in 1916 or 1917. And Hugo Ball, who I pointed out before, was one of the people who was involved in, that's why he had that bizarre costume on. Also, the Dadaists would use non-artistic material, wood, things, collages. They also started developing photo montage, where they were taking their own photographs or taking them out of newspapers and stuff like that and appropriating them and turning them into their own piece of artwork. I want to say one person who you might recognize who was a Fluxus was Yoko Ono, believe it or not. So anyway, it's sort of the period, he started around the end of the 1950s through the 1960s and up into the middle 70s. The Fluxus movement existed in Germany, and I have a feeling you could almost say that Robert Rauschenberg was a Fluxus, except being in the United States, they had to call him something different. Down low is Keith Haring. That's called Red Dog, or Barking Red Dog, excuse me. He was a graffiti artist, which is essentially using non-artistic materials. Again, he managed to monetize it by starting to do work, basically the Barking Red Dog, on paper and on canvas, sort of the same way Basquiat did as well. In back, you can see Kara Walker's silhouettes. Again, non-artistic materials. It's just black paper she cuts out and glues to a white wall and makes a long narrative. She's, I don't know if everybody knows Kara Walker's work, but she's constantly trying to work against misogyny and racism, and that's the theme of most of her narratives. The person going across the water there is actually part of one of Kara Walker's silhouettes, but I sort of am, he and his hat and the island behind, and what you don't see is there's an easel to the right. I sort of call him Tom Curry. And those of you who live around here know Tom Curry. He's shown it. He's a landscape painter. He shows with Karen. He's a friend of mine. We talk and visit each other's studio once in a while. And I just put this in there as a joke to him. So anyway, I guess that's it on Dada. Oh, but Dada, I'll say this sort of, Dada engendered freedom from academic and cultural restraints. And I think that's what happens as we go on. Okay, next. Okay, here's a whole other painting about a different kind of dogma. Icons of the spiritually certain. This is essentially, there are what, probably 12 or 14 major religions in the world. God knows how many real religions there are. It's got to be in the thousands. I don't even represent in this all the religions in the world, but religions tend to, as far as I'm concerned anyway, tend to be the cause of a lot of trauma in the world, a lot of conflict. And I sort of represent that with the two guys there fighting with sticks. They're from Anil Roach, or rock is the way you say it in Germany, I guess, but Roach, I guess, is the English way of saying it. I've changed the heads on them, and the guy on the right is Christopher Hitchens, the atheist, and the guy on the left is L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. And they're battling it out, I guess, for which religion will dominate. And I'm calling atheism is a faith as opposed to a religion, but it's just as much of a faith, really. Next. Okay, in that painting, let's do the one on the right first. This is the goddess Amaterasu, who's a Shinto sun goddess. I took her, and I can't remember the name of the Japanese artist who used her, and I put her head basically, and her clothing and her sword on a pose that comes from a John Sloan painting, which probably a lot of you have seen. It's the painting of, where is it here? Sunday, women drying their hair. It's a young redheaded woman on a tenement with the sheets blowing in the wind behind her, running her hand through her hair, trying to dry it out. She's Irish immigrant, and probably doing the laundry is how she makes her living. I have put up Mormon temple garments as my sheets, just for a touch of humor anyway. And so I put this together, and as sort of adding humor to this painting. The one on the left is Giovanni Bellini. It's young Bacchus. Bacchus is in Roman times is the god of wine. If we take him back to Greece, it's Dionysus, who is the god of wine, but also sort of the god of irrationality and chaos. And as far as the Greek philosophers go, they sort of believe that irrationality and chaos leads to creativity, either good or bad. So that's why I sort of like having him in here, because chaos is what this entire painting is about. It's the chaos of the world religions. competing with each other, trying to tell the other that they're better than each other. Next. Okay, this is 3 newspaper clips on my wall in my studio. And this is where, if you notice in the middle and you look sideways, you can barely read it. It says the Triumph of Irrational Dogma. It's where I got in 2011 when I started thinking about this whole thing. I was sort of halfway through the first painting, the Dada painting. And I was in Harman Tire in Ellsworth getting my tires changed, and I picked up a news magazine and I was thumbing through it, and lo and behold, I saw this editorial or opinion piece basically titled The Triumph of Irrational Dogma. So I surreptitiously ripped it out of the magazine and stuck it in my pocket and didn't say anything about it, and sort of put the magazine back in the rack. And I took this and I pinned it up, and it was about a tax policy. It had nothing to do with I'm making things up and what's going on in the world today, but it's but I put it up, I hung it up, and that's it. Next, I guess. That's about all I have to say about that. Okay, Triumph of Irrational Dogma. This was the painting. This painting was the way of screaming. I had of screaming when I could not at 4 o'clock in the morning sleep over some years ago. I started it around halfway through 2016. I couldn't sleep because I was worried about all sorts of things, like, and these are more, one was the planet burning up. And these are sort of things I thought of today, which are more related to what's going on today, but it all works out to the same thing. Librarians losing their jobs for lending books. Art history professors losing their jobs for teaching art history. History teachers losing their job for teaching history. And finally, or women, this isn't the end, but women lost their personhood, losing their personhood, and so on. You get the idea. Next. Okay, this is in the foreground. It's what everybody asked me about. Yu Min Young. He's a Chinese artist. After Tiananmen Square riots or whatever demonstrations, a group of artists in China, around 8 of them, got together and formed the Cynical Realists. Yu Min Young decided was going to create an icon. So he created his face. He basically did a self-portrait. Everything he does, prior to this, he was doing sort of using Western images. I remember there was one, who did the Death of Marat? Was that David or Ang? I can't remember.
Oh,
but
it was
Ange, whatever. Anyway, and he didn't have the face in, he didn't even have a figure in it. He just had the tub. But as time went on, he's done hundreds of paintings and sculptures with this silly face. It's the way he can do something that's semi-political and get away with it in communist China. This painting here is called The Execution. This is divided, it's all one painting. This is on the left panel, this is on the center panel. In his painting, there's a big brick wall that looks exactly like the wall that goes around the Forbidden City. Around in 2007, he had a show at the Queen's Museum in New York. He has had a big show in, he's one of the one or two critical realists in China who have managed to make a lot of money in the West.
Didn't you say, Rob, that the painting that this was based on sold in 2007 for something like 5.6 million?
I was about to say that, yeah, 5.3 actually.
Yeah.
Sotheby's in London sold the original execution painting here by Yu Min-young for $5.3 million in 2007. Anyway, and also in the left is a Goya from the 3rd of May, 1808. Why don't we go to the next slide?
Before we go to the next one, I'm just going to go back to the original painting so you can see where the Yu Min is there and the Goya is over here. So they're interacting, you know, even though they're in separate panels of the triptych.
Okay, this is the Manet. You can see that Yu Min-young's painting comes almost, or at least the soldiers come almost directly from it. These are, the one on the right is the Manet. There are 5 of 4 of these paintings. One of them has a quick story. One of them he tore up or cut up and threw in the garbage can, and Degas came by and saw it, and he took the pieces home or back to his studio with him, glued them on a piece of linen and framed it, and there were pieces missing out of it, and that's now in the National Museum, in National Gallery in England, in London. Anyway, where the brick wall is in this painting is where Yu Min-young had his brick wall as well, but he didn't have any other people in it other than the ones I showed you in the on the left-hand panel. And the left-hand panel, this is the French in the Iberian Peninsula War, executing peasants who were revolting against French control of the Iberian Peninsula. The interesting thing about the Goya is that he was the first painter in the Western world anyway, who actually did not think of war as a heroic enterprise. He showed the horror of executions and blood and things like that in the Iberian War. He did an entire series of etchings, the horrors of war, again, which is repeated in my big, my triptych by the Chapman brother. You know, keep going.
Well, isn't this where you have the two?
No. This is something else. I'm just bringing, hang on, Karen. In the triptych, and you're not going to be able to see it, there's another Goya copy by another group of 2 brothers, the Chapman brothers, who are artists, who did a life-size study or a sculpture of one of his horror of war images. Okay, next. Okay, Manet again. This Le Déjeuner sur le Hub, such good French, huh? Luncheon on the grass. Manet, there's actually in the real painting, which we're not showing you, there's another naked lady who's in the background, or she's almost naked in the background. Basically, we have two dressed males sort of entertaining this woman and the other woman who's naked. He attempted to enter into the salon in France in 1883, and it was rejected because it was considered obscene. And I here as basically it represents misogyny to me. But interesting enough, the salon rejected it for sort of the same reason. Whereas he did enter it in they have after the salon, they have a refused artist show as well in a different place. That was in that, and it got panned there by all the critics. Anyway, next. Okay, this is Giorgione Pastoral Concert from 300 years before, or 350 years before Manet. And it's assumed that he sort of got the idea from that. Here's two men dressed with two naked ladies entertaining them. And in these, Giorgione and Manet would have not thought about misogyny, but that's how I see it. Next. And finally, we have a Raimondi Judgment of Paris etching, which is a copy of a painting that no longer exists by Raphael. And if you look on the lower right-hand corner, you see exactly the same pose as the Manet painting. The only difference is the guy in the middle has his head in a different direction. And that person on the left, I do believe is a woman. But anyway, and that's where Manet got his setup for his luncheon on the grass. I'm going to talk about Botticelli's Calumny of Apelles. Apelles was a painter in 330 BC, and Botticelli was commissioned to paint a copy of that painting. This woman in the purple, in fact, in the real painting, I think it's blue, tunic, I guess you'd call it, is Calumny, and she's hauling away somebody. I'm not quite sure who he is. And this painting by Botticelli has another, it has King Midas, it has another 5 or 10 people, envy, and all represented by women who are taking place in this calumny. Anyway, he did this painting, Botticelli, talking about appropriating Apelles' work in a sense, did this painting based on a 1,350-year-old secondhand description by a guy named, or Lucian, who is considered the first. He did his description in the entire painting, and Botticelli painted a picture of that, and it wasn't unusual, I guess, at the time in the Renaissance, in Florence, during the Renaissance. There was actually a festival that celebrated this calumny. Anyway, Lucian is considered the first satirist, and he's also did the first version of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which I think is interesting. Neil Jennings, who I mentioned earlier, is one of my favorite artists. This is my interpretation. He was known as the father of bad painting, and back in 1969, my renderings of his work are actually much more detailed than his look like they were done with his thumb. And they're called saw, as you look in the left hand, right where it's being circled, saw and sawed. And I also use the saw blade. I always hide my signature. And if you look real carefully, it says R. Shillady on that saw blade. And Us and Them is an American fighter and a Russian fighter just sort of flying next to each other, threatening each other. Anyway, he did those in 1969. He has gone on to do wonderfully beautiful sort of commentaries on global warming and the destruction it's doing, but they're beautiful paintings that are like, oh, you know, a foot tall and 8 feet wide. Look him up and you'll be blown away, I guarantee it. So go to the next. Okay. When I started Triumph, I sketched in, there are 5 of my landscapes in it. And in them, and then there's also one landscape on Herrick Bay that I had never done. It's where it's in the right-hand panel. It's the pine trees with the eagles and the crows circling around them. Anyway, behind the mountain, which is Saddleback Mountain here in Maine, I put a little yellow line before I got to the blue sky. And that was a trick that Rockwell Kent used to use. So I had sketched in this stuff. It would make the mountains pop. It would make his icebergs pop. And so I used it and it made Saddleback Mountain pop. But I had nothing. I had a sort of a lake and an island in the middle in the left. And I happened to open up an art news, and there was this guy, Tom Utek, and an ad for him. And he had all these birds flying. He's from, I think, Washington or Oregon. And he had all these birds flying across the painting, which I've incorporated some and some of his landscape as well. Because I used it because it sort of had the same color yellows and the purples that I wanted. Also in this painting is a Max Beckmann departure, part of Departure in on the right. It's the woman right there and the rowboat behind it. Then way in back is Durer's Ship of Fools. And then Niarok, who's Fastnacht, which means carnival, who's I sort of consider a follower of Max Beckmann. He came from East Germany, was trained as in social realism, and has become, they call him a surrealist. I sort of think he's a continuation of German expressionism myself. Okay, Picasso, Guernica, think the Goya, think Ukraine. And on the left, this is the Richard Prince. And I put it in because it reminds me of the Ammon Bundy taking over Maher National Wildlife Refuge a couple of years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, for 40 some odd days, and trying to get it back from, or trying to protect some people who illegally were grazing their cows, I guess, and started a fire to burn off grass or something, or trees or brush or something in the wildlife resource. Everybody sort of remembers that standoff for days. But anyway, Richard Prince is sort of a post-minimalist, which is sort of is the carry-on of the Dadaists and the Fluxists and the Neo-Dadaists. He appropriated this photograph from a Marlboro ad and adds some touches of paint. I liked the fact that he had taken yellow and put it on the right-hand side of the cowboy there, and it highlighted. And I did the same thing to the horse in the Picasso. That's not from a Picasso. And it sort of reflects the same thing as the yellow around the mountains and the trees and stuff. And it makes these images pop. I'll just say this about photo montage. Dadaism used photo montage, started photo montage. The Fluxists use photo montage as well, some, but the Neo-Dadaists, Robert Rauschenberg, used photo montage all the time and appropriated photographs from everywhere. And James Rosenquist, the pop artist, and Andy Warhol appropriated photographs all the time from newspapers and magazines and used them in their paintings. Triumph of Irrational Dogma, I use other artists to illustrate the foibles of mankind. Bruegel sums it up in the parable of the blind by showing that in the end, we're all blind leading the blind. And that's it.
That's great, Rob.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.